Tonight we're stepping into the vast and echoing halls of one of history's greatest empires. From a humble settlement of shepherds beside the Tiber River to the marble forums of Rome, from legions marching across continents to emperors cloaked in power and paranoia. This is the story of the Roman Empire. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're lying in the dark, eyes heavy with sleep, or quietly escaping into the past, this moment is yours. Breathe deep, get comfortable. Let your mind drift across time. This is a story over 2,000 years in the making, and tonight, it's all yours. Let's begin. It begins in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, where mist still clings to the earth in the early light of a world not yet formed into empire. The Tiber River murmurs through the lowlands, its slow current winding around the floodplains that will one day bear the weight of marble forums, towering columns, and the heavy footfall of centurions. But now, in this prelude to history, there are only soft reeds brushing the banks and the quiet breathing of wilderness. Before Rome could rise, there was a story. A legend, told and retold until it rooted itself so deeply into the soil of Italy that even the most skeptical voices could not pull it free. The story speaks of twin boys, born of a priestess named Rhea Silvia. She was a Vestal virgin, sworn to chastity by the command of her uncle, King Julius, who feared any challenge to his throne. But fate, it seems, cannot be avoided by decree. The god Mars, cloaked in divine silence, came to Rhea and left her with sons, Romulus and Remus. The king, upon hearing of their birth, ordered them cast into the river. The order was followed. The twins were placed in a basket and left to die in the muddy current of the Tiber. But the river was swollen and sluggish from spring rains, and the current deposited the basket safely in the shallows. There, near the roots of a fig tree, a she-wolf found them. She was not a creature of horror, as later stories would make her. She was a mother with no pups of her own. Her fur was bristled and her breath warm, and she took the boys into her den beneath the Palatine. There she nursed them, and they lived. The shepherd Faustulus later found them and brought them into his home. The twins grew among flocks and fields, unaware of the bloodlines that coiled through their veins. They were bold and stubborn and unafraid of struggle. As young men, they learned the truth of their lineage and helped their grandfather reclaim his rightful throne in Alba Longa. They might have stayed, but they didn't. Something pulled them back to the wilderness near the river. That stretch of land near the 7 hills called to them, and they answered with ambition. They decided to build a new city. But even in the beginning, Rome was forged in conflict. The twins could not agree on where to lay the first stone or who would lead. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill. Remus preferred the Aventine. They consulted omens. Romulus saw more birds. Remus claimed he saw them first. The argument ended with blood in the dirt. Remus was killed. Whether by Romulus himself or by one of his men, the stories differ. But the result was the same. One brother lived. One brother ruled. The survivor drew a line in the earth, marked the limits of his walls, and began to build. No one could cross the sacred boundary without death, he declared. The message was clear. The city would be defended, even if that meant slaying kin. The date given by tradition was April 21st, 753 years before the birth of Christ. That year was remembered not because of the stones or the borders, but because of the will behind them. Romulus named the city after himself and became its first king. Around him, the new city grew in rough circles, simple huts, wooden palisades, and early temples to unknown gods. Men from nearby tribes were drawn to the place, and when few women followed, Romulus orchestrated the infamous Sabine abduction. During a feast, the Romans seized the daughters of the neighboring Sabines and forced them to marry. The act was brutal, but it stitched two peoples together. The Sabine men were eventually reconciled, and the city expanded again. In the decades that followed, Romulus continued to rule, but legends say his end was as mysterious as his beginning. One day, he vanished in a storm, taken up into the sky. His followers believed he had become a god. Whether that was true or not, his city remained. Rome had been born in violence, shaped by ambition, and claimed by divine favor. It would not be the last time that myth and reality blurred, or that the boundaries of empire would be drawn with a sword. But for now, it was still only a village by a river, breathing in the silence before history began to speak. The city that Romulus founded did not remain a solitary dream for long. Rome grew, not only in the number of its citizens, but in the complexity of its identity. It became a city of mingled tribes and uneasy alliances, a place where new laws tried to tame old instincts. Romulus ruled as king until his strange disappearance, and though he was later worshipped as the god Quirinus, his departure left a throne behind. Others would sit upon it. Rome would not yet be a republic or an empire. For more than 200 years, it would be ruled by kings. According to Roman tradition, 7 kings ruled in sequence. The names of some are etched into the foundation stones of legend. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was a Sabine, said to be wise and deeply pious. While Romulus had built walls and forged weapons, Numa turned his attention to temples and time. He shaped the early calendar, created priestly offices, and taught the people to offer sacrifice and keep peace when war was not required. The rituals he established were said to be handed down from the gods themselves. Whether true or not, the people believed. The city became more than a military outpost. It became a place of rhythm and tradition, a society slowly learning the meaning of order. Other kings followed, each leaving marks that would endure. Tullus Hostilius, third of the kings, rejected peace and gloried in conquest. He destroyed the rival city of Alba Longa and transferred its nobles to Rome, expanding the Senate. Ancus Marcius built bridges across the Tiber and extended Roman influence westward. Rome was no longer a village. It was becoming a city of roads and ritual, warriors and artisans, a community bound together by shared ambition. The monarchy had power, but it was not absolute. A council of elders, the Senate, advised the king. The people were divided into tribes and curiae and participated in assemblies, even if their voices were small. In time, Rome began to change more rapidly. The last 3 kings were said to be of Etruscan origin. The Etruscans lived to the north and brought with them new ideas in engineering, religion, and symbolism. Under King Tarquinius Priscus, the Circus Maximus was begun. With Servius Tullius, the city was divided into districts, census records were kept, and the military was reorganized into centuries. Servius was said to be born of a slave woman and rose to power through merit. His rule was long and filled with reform, but it ended in blood, as many reigns did. He was murdered by his son-in-law, a man who would become the last king of Rome. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, remembered only as Tarquin the Proud, took the throne not by consent, but by force. He ruled with cruelty and suspicion. He abolished many rights that his predecessors had protected and governed without the Senate's blessing. His projects were ambitious, including the construction of the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, but his methods were ruthless. His downfall did not come from battle or foreign invasion, but from within his own house. According to the tradition, his son Sextus Tarquinius committed a brutal act against a noblewoman named Lucretia. Her public suicide, in response to the violation, ignited outrage among Rome's leading families. One of them, Lucius Junius Brutus, led a revolt. The people rose. The king was expelled. His family was cast out, and the monarchy itself was declared finished. In its place, the Romans established a new form of government, one that rejected kingship and entrusted power to magistrates elected by citizens. The Republic had begun, though its early years would be fragile. The memory of the kings would linger, a mixture of respect for order and deep distrust of tyranny. For centuries after, no Roman would dare claim the title of king without facing hatred and rebellion. They remembered the end too well. The age of the kings had shaped them, but it had also taught them what power could do when held too tightly. So the crown was broken, and the sword passed to the people, or so they believed. The story of Rome was only beginning, but already its rhythm was set. Glory born of violence, greatness shaped by struggle, and always the desire to build something that would outlive its founders. The monarchy had fallen, and in its place rose an idea, fragile and untested, carried more by hope than certainty. It was called a republic, a public thing, a res publica, and it was designed not to honor kings, but to replace them with men who held power only for a moment before giving it back. Where once there had been a single crown, there were now two consuls, elected annually, each with equal authority, their movements shadowed by the silent caution of the other. The Senate remained as an advisory body of Rome's elders, and assemblies were created to give voice to the citizens, though not all voices weighed equally. It was a system that was orderly on parchment, but real power is never so neat, and Rome, now a republic in name, would spend its earliest years struggling to decide what that truly meant. The Republic's greatest enemy in these early decades was not Carthage, not Gaul, not some distant army marching from the east, but the bitter tension that simmered between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the old families, the landowners, the ones whose fathers and grandfathers had advised kings and who now filled the ranks of the Senate, believing it was their birthright to govern. The plebeians were everyone else, the farmers and artisans and soldiers who bled for the city but found themselves barred from holding office, forbidden from marrying into noble families, and locked out of the laws that governed them. These laws were not written, only spoken, guarded like a secret language by the elite. And so the Republic, born of rebellion, found itself lurching from one internal crisis to the next, as the plebeians fought for recognition in a state that expected their loyalty, but did not yet grant them equality. The first great demand came as a refusal. In 494 BCE, the plebeians walked out. They left the city, climbed a hill outside Rome's walls, and refused to return unless granted the right to representation. It was a bold act in a time when unity meant survival, and the patricians, faced with the threat of a city without its workers and soldiers, gave in. The office of the tribune of the plebs was created, and these tribunes, sacrosanct and untouchable, were empowered to protect the people and to veto unjust measures from the Senate or the consuls. It was a victory, but only the first of many needed. The struggle continued for generations. The plebeians demanded that laws be written down, that justice be visible, that the privileges of the few be balanced by the needs of the many. In time, they won the 12 Tables, Rome's first code of laws, etched into bronze and displayed in the Forum, so that no citizen, high or low, could claim ignorance or be bound by invisible rules. These victories were hard won and never complete. Power, once held, is rarely surrendered without resistance. Patrician families adapted, sometimes giving up small concessions while strengthening their grip elsewhere. The plebeians gained access to new offices, but the path to true parity was long and uneven. Still, the foundations were being laid. Through protest and patience, Rome was shaping itself into a republic not of perfection, but of persistence. It was learning, slowly, that stability must be earned, not inherited, and that greatness does not grow in silence, but in argument, in pressure, and in compromise. Beyond the walls of the city, other challenges pressed in. Rome was not the only city-state on the Italian peninsula. It was one among many, a neighbor to rival tribes and proud peoples who would not easily yield. Rome fought the Latins, battled the Sabines and the Volsci, and learned the brutal rhythms of constant war. In 390 BCE, disaster struck. A Gallic army from the north descended upon the city, and the Roman defenses crumbled. The Senate was slaughtered. The sacred geese of Juno, according to the tale, squawked and shrieked as Gauls climbed the Capitoline hill under cover of darkness. Rome was sacked, its streets filled with fire and blood, and the survivors paid a ransom in gold to buy the city's freedom. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a humiliation that hardened Roman resolve. From the ashes, the Romans rebuilt. They fortified their walls, reformed their army, and vowed that such shame would never be repeated. The Republic endured. It staggered and adapted, fractured and reformed. In the space of a few generations, it became a city no longer ruled by kings, but not yet ruled by law alone. It was an organism of change, a body politic that grew stronger by breaking and repairing itself, again and again. Its citizens argued, marched, rebelled, and served. The legions were taking shape, the offices were multiplying, and the dream of a republic, still unclear in its final form, continued to pulse beneath the surface of every law, every sword, and every stone laid in the growing city of Rome. The city of Rome did not grow because it was destined to. It grew because it fought. The hills and valleys of the Italian peninsula were not empty, nor were they waiting to be ruled. They were already claimed by old cities and older traditions, by proud mountain tribes, coastal Greeks, and Etruscan kings who had ruled before Rome had even been born. Rome did not conquer Italy in a single sweep, nor did it absorb its neighbors with the ease that later poets would pretend. It fought for every mile, and the story of Rome's rise from a struggling city to the master of all Italy is a slow, bruising record of wars that wore down armies and reshaped identities, each battle leaving behind the foundations of something larger than what had come before. At first, the struggle was for survival. After the Gallic sack in 390 BCE, Rome hardened its borders and began to look beyond them. Its early expansion was not the methodical spread of an empire, but a series of tangled conflicts, retaliations, broken treaties, and territorial skirmishes. The Latin League, made up of cities that had once been Rome's equals, rebelled against Roman dominance. The response was swift and merciless. Rome dismantled the League and replaced it with a new model. Each city would be bound to Rome alone, no longer allied with one another, but tied directly through treaties, obligations, and carefully calculated rewards. This system did not grant equality, but it offered inclusion. Cities that submitted could keep their local governments, their gods, and their festivals. In return, they gave soldiers. They gave loyalty, and over time, they gave in. To the east, the fierce Samnites controlled the rugged mountains of central Italy. Rome and the Samnites would clash again and again in a series of long and exhausting wars. The Samnites were tenacious and skilled at guerrilla warfare, ambushing Roman legions in narrow valleys and rocky passes. In one of the most humiliating defeats of Roman history, Roman soldiers were forced to pass under a symbolic yoke after surrendering at the Caudine Forks. The shame lingered for years, but Rome did not forget. It regrouped, retrained, and returned. The Samnite Wars stretched across generations, but the result was inevitable. Rome's armies became more adaptable, its alliances deeper, its road systems more refined. It was not only fighting battles, it was building infrastructure for the next ones. Rome then turned south, toward the Greek colonies that dotted the coastal regions of Magna Graecia. These cities were wealthy and sophisticated, proud of their Hellenic heritage, and often disdainful of the Roman upstarts from the interior. When Rome's growing influence threatened the independence of the city of Tarentum, the Greeks appealed to a savior from across the sea. King Pyrrhus of Epirus answered the call. A descendant of Alexander the Great's generals, Pyrrhus arrived with elephants, trained phalanxes, and the confidence of someone who had won wars before. He met the Romans in battle and won, but each victory came with devastating losses. After several costly engagements, he looked back on his victories and said that one more such triumph would ruin him. His campaign collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. The Romans, battered but unbroken, remained. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, there was no power in Italy capable of challenging Rome's authority. The Samnites were subdued. The Etruscan cities had been absorbed. The Greek colonies, one by one, had either surrendered or been taken. But Rome did not impose a single model of governance across the peninsula. Instead, it wove a patchwork system of colonies, treaties, and citizenship rights. Some cities were granted full Roman citizenship. Others were given partial rights. Still others remained formally independent but were bound to Rome through military obligations. This uneven system was not a mistake. It was a design meant to keep cities loyal to Rome, but isolated from one another, unable to organize any united resistance. With Italy secured, Rome had more soldiers than ever before. It had roads that connected its colonies, legions trained through constant conflict, and a sense of destiny growing inside its people, like fire under stone. But there was more than just destiny ahead. There was wealth, opportunity, and danger across the sea. To the south, Carthage ruled the waters and the trade routes. Its ships patrolled the coasts of Sicily. Its merchants stretched from Spain to North Africa. Rome's expansion into Italy had brought it to the very edge of another world power. The wars of the peninsula were finished. The wars of empire were about to begin. The wars of Italy had taught Rome how to endure, how to bleed without breaking, how to bind a people together not through unity of birth or culture, but through shared law, shared purpose, and the promise of belonging in something larger than the self. But across the sea, another power had been rising just as steadily, built not on legions, but on sails, not on conquest by land, but on wealth gathered from the deep. The city of Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa, its harbours filled with merchant ships, and its walls strong enough to withstand any land army. It was a city of traders and admirals, of markets and temples, of fierce independence and quiet ambition. Its reach extended across the western Mediterranean, and for a time, Rome and Carthage had existed in a state of wary tolerance, each aware of the other's strength, but content to grow in opposite directions. That peace would not last. The island of Sicily lay between them, a land of rich fields and strategic harbours, and it would become the spark that ignited a century of war. In the middle of the 3rd century BCE, a small mercenary group seized the Sicilian city of Messana and found themselves caught between larger forces. Carthage arrived first, offering to restore order. Rome, seeing a Carthaginian foothold so close to the Italian coast, could not ignore the threat. The Senate debated, and with some reluctance, sent legions across the strait. It was a decision made in caution, but it would draw Rome into its first true war beyond the peninsula. The First Punic War had begun. It was a conflict neither side had fully prepared for. Carthage dominated the sea, and Rome had little experience in naval warfare. But the Romans, as always, learned quickly. They built ships modelled after captured Carthaginian vessels, trained crews with relentless discipline, and developed a boarding device called the corvus that turned sea battles into hand-to-hand struggles, more familiar to Roman soldiers. For more than 2 decades, the war dragged on. Rome won battles, then lost fleets to storms. Carthage countered with its superior navy, but struggled to hold territory inland. Cities changed hands, alliances shifted, and the island of Sicily became a graveyard for thousands. In the end, it was Rome's resilience that prevailed. In 241 BCE, after a final naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, Carthage sued for peace. Rome imposed harsh terms. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Republic had stepped beyond Italy and claimed foreign soil as its own. But peace with Carthage was shallow, and time did not heal the wounds. When Carthage turned its attention to Spain, hoping to rebuild its power through new conquests and silver mines, Rome watched with suspicion. Tensions grew with every campaign. The final blow came not from Rome, but from a Carthaginian general whose name would become etched into Roman memory with fire. Hannibal Barca, son of a commander from the First War, took an oath in childhood to never make peace with Rome. In 218 BCE, he acted on that vow. Leading a multinational army from Spain, Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, forded rivers, and did what no Roman thought possible. He led his forces across the Alps and descended into Italy, bringing war directly to the heart of the Republic. It was not only an invasion, it was a masterstroke of strategy. Hannibal's army, battered and diminished from the mountains, still managed to win battle after battle. At the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, at the horrific plain of Cannae, he outmaneuvered and annihilated Roman legions. Tens of thousands died in a single day at Cannae, a circle of death so complete that even hardened commanders lost hope. Cities in the south of Italy defected. Panic gripped Rome. But the Republic did not surrender. It adapted. Under the cautious leadership of Fabius Maximus, Rome avoided open battle and harassed Hannibal's supply lines. Hannibal remained in Italy for more than a decade, undefeated but isolated, a threat that Rome could not crush but refused to bow before. Meanwhile, Rome fought elsewhere. In Spain, young generals rose to prominence. One of them, Publius Cornelius Scipio, proved himself a brilliant commander. He captured New Carthage, drove Carthaginian forces from the Iberian Peninsula, and brought the war to North Africa. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio and Hannibal met for the first and only time. It was a reversal of Cannae. This time, it was the Roman strategy that prevailed. Hannibal's elephants were turned against him. His infantry, worn and outnumbered, could not withstand the Roman legions. Carthage was defeated. Hannibal survived, but the war was lost. Rome imposed even harsher terms than before, stripping Carthage of its fleet and its independence in foreign policy. Scipio was given the title Africanus, and Rome stood supreme in the Western Mediterranean. The Second Punic War had shaken the Republic to its core, but it had also proven something essential about Roman identity. Victory was not born from brilliance alone. It came from stubbornness, from an ability to endure disaster and keep fighting, from a system that could lose battles, but never lose its will. Rome had not only survived Hannibal, it had learned from him, and that knowledge would shape the next phase of its ascent. Rome had emerged from the Second Punic War, not only victorious, but transformed. It had faced one of the greatest generals in history, lost more men than could be counted, seen its fields burned and its alliances strained to the breaking point, and still it had endured. But the republic that now ruled was no longer the same creature that had once fought for survival in the hills of Latium. It was larger, more confident, and increasingly unafraid of expanding into foreign lands. The wars against Carthage had trained its people to think beyond their own peninsula, and with that shift came a new appetite, not just for defense or survival, but for dominance. The Mediterranean, once a sea divided among competing cultures and rival powers, was now beginning to take on the shape of a Roman lake. The Republic was not yet an empire, but it was behaving like one. The remnants of Carthaginian power still flickered after Zama, but they burned low, and Rome kept a watchful eye on every spark. Carthage had been stripped of its navy, forbidden from waging war without Rome's consent, and crushed under a heavy burden of tribute. Yet it remained a trading city, prosperous in commerce and rich in agriculture. For a generation, it paid its debts faithfully and posed no threat. But prosperity itself became an irritant. There were senators in Rome who believed that Carthage should not be allowed to recover. Chief among them was Cato the Elder, who ended every speech, regardless of topic, with the same grim refrain, that Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, when Carthage responded with force against an African neighbor in self-defense, Rome seized the opportunity. War was declared once again. The Third Punic War was less a battle than an execution. Rome sent an army not to negotiate but to destroy. Carthage resisted fiercely, withstanding a brutal siege that lasted 3 years. Families starved, fires raged in the streets. When Roman forces finally broke through, they fought house by house, dragging survivors into slavery and killing those who resisted. The city was leveled. According to legend, the land was salted to prevent anything from growing, though that part may be poetic invention. But Carthage was only one part of the Mediterranean story. While it had dominated the West, Greece and the Hellenistic kingdoms ruled the East. Macedonia, the homeland of Alexander the Great, had once controlled a vast empire stretching to the edge of India. After his death, his generals carved up his conquests into competing realms. By the 2nd century BCE, these kingdoms still wielded considerable influence, but they had also grown complacent. Rome, fresh from its victories in the West, turned its gaze eastward. At first, it claimed only to protect allies, but protection soon became interference, and interference led to war. The Macedonian Wars were a series of conflicts that allowed Rome to insert itself deeper into Greek politics with each passing decade. When Macedon resisted Roman pressure, war was declared. When Greek cities rose up in revolt, Rome responded with force. By 146 BCE, the same year that Carthage was destroyed, Rome also crushed Corinth, the heart of Greek commerce. Statues were looted, temples burned. The treasures of Hellenic civilization were packed onto Roman ships and carried west. Greece, once the teacher of Rome in art and philosophy, had become a province. The symmetry of that year was impossible to ignore. In a matter of months, two ancient powers, Carthage in the west and Greece in the east, had been brought to ruin. Rome stood alone. What followed was not a formal declaration of empire, but an imperial reality. Provinces were established in Spain, in North Africa, in Greece, in Asia Minor. Governors were appointed to oversee them, some just and disciplined, others corrupt and greedy. The wealth of the world poured into Rome: gold, slaves, spices, art, grain. Senators returned from distant campaigns with fortunes unimaginable to their fathers. Villas multiplied along the Italian countryside. The city itself expanded, its population swelling, its buildings rising in marble and ambition. The Forum filled with monuments to victory. Triumphs marched through the streets, celebrating generals who had pushed Rome's frontiers farther than ever before. Yet even as Rome mastered the Mediterranean, cracks had begun to form beneath its foundation. The armies were changing. Once composed of citizen soldiers who returned home to their fields, they were now fighting in distant lands for years at a time, and those who returned often found their farms ruined or sold to pay debts. The rich grew richer, buying up the land and working it with slaves captured in conquest. The poor crowded into the city, dependent on grain doles and resentful of a system that seemed to serve only the powerful. The Senate, filled with men who claimed to serve the Republic, often served only themselves. Rome had conquered the world, but it was beginning to lose control of itself. The Mediterranean was quiet for now. The pirates had been swept away. The rival powers had been defeated or absorbed. From Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt, the shadow of Rome stretched wide. But that shadow was no longer cast only outward. It had begun to fall across the Republic itself. The wars to come would not be fought across oceans. They would be fought at home. The empire had grown faster than its people could manage. What had begun as a city of farmers and soldiers, organized into tribes and bound by shared rituals, had become a state stretched across seas and deserts. A state whose administrators could no longer see its borders from any hilltop. Victory had brought silver, grain, and slaves in overwhelming abundance, but it had also brought imbalance. The Roman Republic, so carefully designed to keep power rotating between offices and social classes, found itself swaying under the weight of its own success. The Senate still met and debated, the assemblies still voted, but behind the ceremonies, something was shifting. The gap between rich and poor had grown too wide, and now it began to split the foundations of the state. The countryside was the first to show the fracture. When Roman citizens had gone to fight abroad, they had left behind farms, families, and livelihoods. But while they fought, their land was often seized by creditors or left to decay in their absence. The great estates, owned by aristocrats who had grown wealthy on war plunder, expanded across the Italian hillsides. These latifundia were worked not by citizens, but by slaves, many of them captured during Rome's wars in Greece, Spain, and Africa. The free farmers who had once been the backbone of the Republic returned home to find themselves dispossessed, with no land to till and no future to claim. They poured into the city, forming a restless mass of veterans and laborers who were no longer bound to the old values of the Republic, who now relied on grain distributions and promises from ambitious politicians who claimed to speak in their name. Into this volatile landscape stepped the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Born into a noble family, but raised with a deep sense of duty to the people, the Gracchi believed the Republic could be healed if only it returned to its roots. In 133 BCE, Tiberius, as tribune of the plebs, proposed a bold land reform. Public land that had been illegally seized by the wealthy would be redistributed to the poor, giving citizens a chance to rebuild their lives. It was a plan rooted in law, but it was met with fury. The Senate, threatened by the loss of property and power, resisted. Tiberius bypassed them. He brought his reforms directly to the people, challenging the norms of Roman politics and igniting outrage among the elite. When he sought re-election to the tribunate, a move seen as dangerously close to monarchy, his enemies acted. He was attacked and killed during a riot on the Capitoline Hill. His body was thrown into the Tiber without ceremony. The message was clear. Rome could tolerate hunger and injustice, but it would not tolerate challenge to its traditions. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus took up his brother's cause. He was more charismatic, more organized, and even more ambitious. He proposed a wide set of reforms: land distribution, subsidized grain, citizenship rights for Italian allies, and judicial reforms to weaken senatorial control of the courts. His speeches drew massive crowds. His proposals gained momentum. But again, resistance grew. The Senate, now more cautious, did not move against him directly. Instead, it empowered rival tribunes and waited for public opinion to shift. When violence finally erupted between his supporters and the state, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a final decree authorizing any force necessary to protect the Republic. Gaius fled. Surrounded on a wooded slope across the river, he asked a slave to take his life before the state could. His head was taken as a trophy. His followers were hunted and executed. Reform had ended in blood once again. The deaths of the Gracchi were more than political defeats. They marked the beginning of a new age in Roman politics, one where violence was no longer a last resort, but a tool of persuasion. The Senate had shown it would kill to preserve its power, and future politicians learned to wield fear just as effectively. New figures emerged, generals who courted the masses, commanders who promised their soldiers not just pay, but land, glory, and security in return for loyalty. One of them was Gaius Marius, a man from humble origins who rose through military achievement. He reformed the army, opening its ranks to the landless poor, who in turn became more loyal to him than to the state. His victories in North Africa and against barbarian invaders from the north made him a hero. His rise to power through repeated consulships made him a warning. The old traditions had said no man should hold such authority for so long. But the traditions were breaking. Marius had shown that if the people supported you, and if the legions followed you, the old rules no longer mattered. Soon after came Sulla, an aristocrat turned general, a man who saw in Marius a rival and in the Republic a weapon to be used. When conflict broke out over command of a military campaign in the east, Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, an act that had never been done before. He entered the city, not as a statesman, but as a conqueror. He seized power, drove Marius into exile, and appointed himself dictator. When Marius returned, the city was soaked again in blood. Political enemies were hunted, their names posted on public lists, their property seized, their families destroyed. When Sulla regained control, he did the same, but more ruthlessly. He claimed to be restoring the Republic, but his methods had torn it apart. After years of violence, he retired from public life, leaving behind a government that was technically intact, but spiritually broken. The Republic had survived the Punic Wars, survived Hannibal, survived centuries of external threats. But now it was at war with itself. The streets were no longer safe. The elections were no longer honest. The Senate no longer ruled. It merely reacted. And somewhere, quietly and inevitably, the idea of Rome as a republic, of shared power and citizen governance, was beginning to fade. The people had started to look not to the law, but to the strong. They were looking for someone who could bring order, even if it came with a crown. Amid the broken promises of the Republic and the blood that had soaked the Forum stones, a new figure began to rise. His name had already echoed in Roman ears for generations: Caesar. A name descended from a noble patrician house, a name with claims to ancient gods and royal ancestors. But for most of his early life, Gaius Julius Caesar had little more than a name and ambition. He had grown up in the shadows of political purges, watched his allies fall to Sulla's prescriptions, and learned that power in Rome came not from tradition, but from timing, from influence, and most of all, from risk. He was charming, eloquent, brilliant, and tireless. He studied rhetoric, mastered law, served in the military, and climbed each rung of Roman political life with a calculated hunger that was as deliberate as it was patient. He understood the Republic not as something sacred, but as a game, and he intended to win it. Caesar aligned himself with the populares, the faction that claimed to represent the common people, though many of its champions were themselves aristocrats. He courted the urban poor with promises of reform, entertained the masses with games, and cultivated an image that blended humility with grandeur. But he did not rise alone. Rome was no longer a place where one man could succeed without allies. Caesar formed a political alliance with two of the most powerful figures of the time. Each man had his needs. Together, they intended to control Rome from behind the curtain. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. He used his position to pass laws that favored his allies and challenged the Senate's authority. The old guard fumed, but they could not stop him. When his term ended, he secured a military command in Gaul, the broad, wild land that stretched beyond the Alps and was home to dozens of tribes that had long resisted Roman control. What followed was one of the most remarkable campaigns in Roman history. For nearly a decade, Caesar fought and conquered in Gaul, defeating coalition after coalition, crossing rivers, building fortifications, and bending the region to Rome's will. He crossed into Britain, the edge of the known world, and returned with stories that only deepened his legend. He wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns, sending them back to Rome where they were read aloud like epics. The people loved him, his soldiers adored him, his enemies feared him, and all the while he grew more powerful than any Roman had ever been without wearing a crown. But power cannot be shared indefinitely. Crassus died in battle in the east, trying to match Caesar's glory. Pompey, left in Rome, grew distant and suspicious. The Senate, led by Caesar's rivals, sought to strip him of command and bring him to trial. They feared what he had become. They feared what he might do. Caesar was ordered to return to Rome, but only if he left his army behind. It was a line drawn not in law, but in fear. And Caesar, who knew better than anyone that crossing lines was how power was claimed, made his decision. In 49 BCE, He led his army across the Rubicon River, a shallow stream that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. It was an act of treason. It was also a declaration. He had chosen civil war over submission. According to tradition, as he crossed the river, he said the words that would echo for centuries. The die is cast. Rome erupted into chaos. Pompey fled to the east, gathering an army in Greece. Caesar pursued him across the sea. The two men who had once stood side by side as allies now faced one another on the battlefield. At Pharsalus, in 48 BCE, Caesar's forces crushed Pompey's despite being outnumbered. Pompey escaped to Egypt, where he was murdered by a local court, hoping to please the victor. Caesar arrived soon after and was presented with Pompey's severed head. He did not smile. He wept. Whether out of sorrow or strategy, no one could say for certain. He lingered in Egypt, entangling himself in the dynastic struggles of the Ptolemies and aligning himself with Cleopatra, a brilliant and charismatic queen who would become his lover and the mother of his only known son. Together they traveled the Nile. Together they dreamed of what might come next. When Caesar returned to Rome, there was no one left to oppose him. He was appointed dictator, first for a year, then for 10, then for life. He reformed the calendar, revived the Senate with new members, planned colonies for veterans, and introduced laws meant to ease debt and control grain supply. He refused to act like a king, but he accepted honors that blurred the difference. Statues were raised. His image was printed on coins. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate, wore a purple robe, and answered only to himself. The Republic had become a memory, and in that memory, resentment stirred. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of the Roman month, in 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate house, unaware or unwilling to believe the danger that awaited him. A group of senators, many of them former allies, gathered around him with concealed blades. They stabbed him, one after another, more than 20 times. He fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey, the man he had once defeated, and died with no final words that history could confirm. The conspirators thought they had saved the Republic. Instead, they opened its final wound. Caesar's death did not restore the old order. It shattered what little remained. Rome would bleed again, this time not over policy or law, but over the question of who would rule the ruins he left behind. In the weeks that followed Caesar's murder, the streets of Rome filled with murmurs and unease. The conspirators had believed the Republic would spring back to life, but the Republic no longer breathed on its own. It had become a fragile memory, too battered by years of corruption and violence to reassemble itself, simply because a tyrant had fallen. The Senate had no plan beyond Caesar's death. The people, shocked and uncertain, did not cheer. They grieved. They poured into the forum, where Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and fellow consul, stood before them with fire in his voice and grief in his eyes. He read Caesar's will aloud. He named Caesar's heir. He showed them the bloodied cloak. And with every word, the crowd shifted from confusion to fury. Rome did not rise to restore the Republic. It rose to avenge Caesar. The man named in Caesar's will as his adopted son and political successor was not a celebrated general or a seasoned senator. He was a teenager. His name was Gaius Octavius, and at the time of Caesar's death, he was in Greece, completing his studies and gathering no particular fame. But when he received the news and the name, he did not hesitate. He crossed the sea, entered Rome with quiet confidence, and began to gather allies. He was young, but not foolish. He did not attack the Senate. He did not shout or boast. He negotiated. He watched. He waited. And when the moment was right, he joined forces with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus to form a new ruling alliance, a second triumvirate given legal power by the state to crush the assassins and restore order. Together, they hunted down Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, and defeated them at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. The men who had tried to save the Republic ended their lives by their own hands on a distant battlefield, far from the city they had hoped to preserve. But no alliance in Rome was built to last. Octavian and Antony soon turned on one another, their rivalry growing more dangerous with every province they claimed. Antony settled in the east, where he fell further under the influence of Cleopatra. Their union was both romantic and political, and it stirred deep suspicion in Rome. Octavian stayed in the west, consolidating his power, portraying himself as the guardian of Roman tradition and quietly preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The Senate, weary of civil war and hungry for stability, backed the man who promised to defend Roman values. In 31 BCE, the two sides clashed at sea near the promontory of Actium. Octavian's forces prevailed. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, where they later died by their own hands rather than face the humiliation of capture. With their deaths, the last obstacle was removed. Octavian stood alone, but he did not declare himself king. He knew Rome too well. Instead, he accepted honors granted by the Senate, allowed them to crown him with new titles, and claimed only to restore the Republic. In 27 BCE, he took the name Augustus, meaning the revered one. He styled himself as Princeps, the first citizen, a man of the people, a servant of the Senate. Yet in truth, his power was absolute. The Senate acted at his direction. The armies swore loyalty to him. The provinces answered to his governors. And the people, weary of chaos, welcomed him with open arms. He was not the destroyer of the Republic. He was its transformation. Under Augustus, Rome entered a period of remarkable peace and prosperity. It would later be called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a time when the frontiers were secured, trade flourished, and cities across the empire blossomed under the protection of Roman law and order. Augustus reformed the tax system, strengthened the borders, built roads and aqueducts, and patronized the arts. He filled the city with marble as he had promised, and made Rome not just a political capital, but the glittering heart of an empire. He reshaped the military into a professional force loyal to the state, not to individual generals. He established the Praetorian Guard to protect his person and maintain security in the capital. He reigned for more than 4 decades, long enough for an entire generation to grow up knowing no ruler but him. But beneath the calm surface, the structure he built remained fragile. His succession was never clearly settled. He had no surviving sons. He adopted relatives, planned for heirs, but watched many of them die before him. In the end, he chose his stepson Tiberius, a capable but brooding man who lacked his charisma. Still, Augustus lived long enough to prepare the transition. When he died in 14 CE, the Senate declared him a god, temples were raised in his name, and the empire he had shaped stood firm. The Republic was gone in all but name, replaced by something new, something more enduring. The people had not resisted. They had accepted the trade. Chaos for order, violence for stability. The vote for a voice that could still be heard, even if it was no longer decisive. Rome had passed from the age of citizens to the age of emperors, and the world, from the dusty hills of Judea to the windswept shores of Britannia, now answered to the will of one man. When Augustus died, he left behind more than a city of marble and an empire of provinces. he left behind a question that no Senate could resolve and no law could properly answer. Who would rule next? The Republic had always chosen its leaders in theory, but the empire Augustus built could not afford a power vacuum or a contested election. The soldiers needed orders, the governors needed directives, the borders needed defense, and the people, now accustomed to decades of calm, needed a name to place at the top of their prayers and petitions. That name became Tiberius, a man who had not sought power but accepted it out of duty and inheritance. He was the stepson of Augustus, a seasoned general and a man of cautious temperament. Where Augustus had been charming and visionary, Tiberius was closed and cold, more comfortable with military ranks than senatorial applause. But he understood the machinery of empire, and he maintained it with discipline. Under Tiberius, the system Augustus had built held together. The provinces remained orderly. The legions stayed loyal. Taxes were collected, roads maintained, laws enforced. Yet in the capital, suspicion began to fester. Tiberius trusted few people and surrounded himself with informants and spies. He relied heavily on the Praetorian Guard, especially its commander Sejanus, who grew bold enough to believe he might one day rule himself. When Tiberius withdrew from public life and retreated to the island of Capri, Sejanus governed in his absence, executing rivals and consolidating power until he too was finally exposed and killed. The final years of Tiberius's reign were marked by fear and uncertainty, not for the provinces, but for the political class of Rome itself. The Senate bowed, the people kept quiet, and the empire waited. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the throne passed to his grandnephew, a young man named Gaius, though the world would come to know him as Caligula. His childhood had been one of shadows and blood. His father, the beloved general Germanicus, had died young under suspicious circumstances. His mother and brothers had been executed or exiled by Tiberius. Caligula survived by hiding his thoughts and learning how to please the powerful. When he became emperor, the people rejoiced. He was young, handsome, and the son of a hero. For the first few months, his rule seemed filled with promise. He pardoned prisoners, gave bonuses to soldiers, and staged lavish games. But then something changed. Whether from illness or pressure, or years of concealed trauma, Caligula's mind began to fray. He declared himself a living god, dressed as Jupiter, demanded worship, and treated the Senate with open contempt. His cruelty was theatrical and unrelenting. He executed for sport, spent fortunes in days, and ruled not with reason, but with spectacle. After 4 years, he was murdered by members of his own guard. His death brought chaos until the Praetorian Guard found his uncle hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate was stunned, but it did not resist. Claudius was an unlikely ruler. He was bookish, awkward, and afflicted with a stammer that had long led others to dismiss him. But beneath the surface was a sharp mind, a love of history, and a methodical patience. He accepted the role of emperor not out of hunger, but out of survival. And once in power, he governed with care. Claudius expanded the empire by conquering Britannia, adding another jewel to Rome's crown. He reformed the bureaucracy, improved the judicial system, and granted citizenship to more provincials than any emperor before him. He married unwisely, however, and his final years were overshadowed by palace intrigue. His last wife, Agrippina the Younger, ensured her son by a previous marriage would succeed him. According to many accounts, she poisoned Claudius to hasten that succession. Whether true or not, the result was the same. In 54 CE, her son Nero became emperor. Nero was young, theatrical, and raised on a diet of politics and paranoia. For a time, he ruled under the guidance of wise advisors like Seneca, but that balance soon broke. Nero yearned not to govern, but to perform. He sang on stage, raced chariots, and fancied himself a poet and artist, rather than a statesman. Rome, in his view, was a theatre, and he its star. When a massive fire consumed much of the city in 64 CE, Nero's response was more focused on rebuilding in his own image than on aiding the victims. He constructed a grand palace on the ruins, complete with an artificial lake and a colossal statue of himself. He blamed the fire on the Christians, a small and unpopular sect at the time, and launched a brutal persecution. Executions, torture, and crucifixions followed, many carried out as public entertainment. His rule grew more erratic with time. He killed his mother, his wives, and any senator he deemed disloyal. Eventually, the provinces rebelled. The legions declared for other leaders. Nero, abandoned and alone, fled the capital and took his own life. He was 30 years old. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end. The line that had begun with Augustus passed through Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero was finished. What remained was the empire itself, not bound to a family, but still standing. The Senate scrambled to fill the void. The army looked for strength. The people once again held their breath. But the imperial system, for all its flaws and fragility, had endured. The throne could be emptied, but the empire would not collapse. Not yet. The idea of Rome had grown too large, too deep, too necessary. It would live on, carried forward by emperors who would come and go, each leaving their mark upon the marble that Augustus had once promised. After Nero's death, Rome entered a year of uncertainty. It was called the Year of the Four Emperors, a chaotic stretch of civil war and shifting loyalties, when generals from across the empire claimed the throne through the will of their soldiers rather than the vote of the Senate. The empire had grown too large to be governed from a single city without the backing of the legions. Galba was the first to seize power, but he lacked the favor of the army and was quickly overthrown. Otho followed, then Vitellius, each ruling for months before being killed or deposed. Blood flowed in the streets and across distant provinces as the empire trembled beneath the weight of its own uncertainty. But out of this turmoil emerged a man who would restore stability, not through terror or charm, but through discipline and clarity. His name was Vespasian, and he had spent his life in the service of the state, rising through military command with no illusions about power or legacy. He was not born into nobility, nor shaped by courtly ambition. He was practical, experienced, and weary of chaos. And under his rule, Rome began to recover. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty and rebuilt what had been damaged by the excesses of Nero and the fires of civil war. He restored financial order, launched public building projects, and placed competence above lineage in appointments of authority. It was under him that the Colosseum began to rise in the heart of Rome, a monument to both spectacle and imperial strength. His sons, Titus and Domitian, succeeded him in turn. Titus, remembered for his kindness and decisiveness, reigned during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Domitian, more autocratic and suspicious, ruled for a longer stretch, but was assassinated by his own court. The dynasty ended with his death, but the structure of the empire, now reinforced and more securely administered, endured. The Senate, in rare agreement with the military, chose a successor not from blood, but from merit. That choice would begin what later historians called the era of the 5 good emperors. The first of them was Nerva, an elderly senator with no children and no delusions of eternal rule. He governed with moderation, restored some senatorial authority, and most importantly, adopted a capable successor. That man was Trajan, a Spanish-born general whose leadership would carry Rome to its greatest territorial extent. Trajan was bold and ambitious, beloved by the legions, and tireless in pursuit of conquest. He marched east, defeating the Dacians and seizing their gold mines. He extended Roman influence deep into the Near East, capturing Armenia, Mesopotamia, and reaching as far as the Persian Gulf. The empire, under his command, stretched from the shores of the Atlantic to the deserts of Arabia, from the forests of Britannia to the edge of the Indian world. It was a scale no Roman had ever imagined, and Trajan stood at its center, admired not only for his victories, but for his fairness and dignity. When Trajan died, he was succeeded by his adopted son Hadrian, a man of intellect and restlessness, more interested in securing the empire's borders than in expanding them. He abandoned some of Trajan's eastern conquests, understanding that an empire too large would crumble from within. He traveled constantly, inspecting cities and fortresses, issuing reforms, commissioning architecture, and promoting Greek culture alongside Roman tradition. In the wild northern reaches of Britannia, he ordered the construction of a vast wall to keep out the Pictish tribes. Hadrian's wall became a symbol not of conquest, but of stability. He saw the empire not as a battlefield, but as a community, and he governed with the long view in mind. He was known for his curiosity, his patronage of the arts, and his enduring sadness. He died with no surviving sons, but he chose his heir carefully. Antoninus Pius followed, perhaps the most peaceful of the emperors. His reign saw no major wars, no great rebellions, no dramatic spectacles of cruelty or chaos. He ruled with a calm and steady hand, refining law, supporting education, and strengthening the bonds between Rome and its provinces. He remained in Italy, managing the empire from the center rather than marching through its corners. His rule became a golden memory for future generations, a time of simplicity and decency. When he died, the empire passed to Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5. Marcus was a philosopher, a thinker trained in the Stoic tradition, a man who believed deeply in duty and the fleeting nature of human life. But he ruled not in peace, but in crisis. Invasions surged across the Danube. Plagues swept through the cities. The legions fought constantly to hold the frontiers. Marcus did not retreat from these trials. He traveled with his armies, shared their hardships, and wrote reflections in the quiet moments between campaigns. Those writings, collected later as the Meditations, revealed a man burdened by power, but still devoted to service. He saw the empire as a test of character, not merely a throne to occupy. His reign was long and difficult, but he never wavered. Together, these 5 emperors created an era of rare balance. The empire was ruled not by inheritance or whim, but by chosen leaders who placed stability above vanity. The Senate retained respect, the people were fed, the provinces were protected. Rome had become a civilization not only of conquest, but of law, architecture, philosophy, and culture. It had reached its height. The machine was running smoothly, but all golden ages end, not in fire at first, but in silence. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he did what none of his predecessors had done. He gave the empire to his son. That son was Commodus, and with that decision, the long ascent of Rome would begin to turn. To live in the Roman Empire during the Pax Romana was to live in the stillness between storms. It was a time when the world felt whole, as if its edges had been stitched together by Roman roads and Roman law, as if there were no land left unconquered, no sea left wild. This peace, lasting nearly 2 centuries from the rise of Augustus to the death of Marcus Aurelius, was not without its shadows. There were skirmishes along the borders, revolts in forgotten corners, outbreaks of plague and poverty, but for most of the people within the empire's vast reach, this period was as close to order as any civilization had ever known. The Pax Romana was not peace in the modern sense. It was a quiet enforced by legions, a balance kept through discipline, a stillness that came not from kindness, but from power. And yet, for those who lived under its shadow, it was real. The empire stretched across continents. It moved from the rocky coasts of Hispania to the dark forests of Germania, from the windswept cliffs of Britannia to the heat of Egyptian deserts. It touched the mountains of Armenia, the olive groves of Greece, the markets of Syria, and the shores of North Africa. More than 50 million people lived beneath its banner. They spoke dozens of languages, worshipped hundreds of gods, and followed customs that had been ancient before Rome was born. And yet, through an intricate network of governors, magistrates, military outposts, and trade routes, Rome managed to bring a strange kind of unity to it all, not through erasure, but through absorption. The empire did not wipe out local traditions. It often let them live, so long as taxes were paid, loyalty was given, and rebellion stayed far from the streets. Life within the cities was a rhythm of noise and structure. Rome itself had become a crowded capital of marble and smoke, filled with bathhouses, temples, amphitheatres, and tenement buildings that leaned against one another like exhausted soldiers. The poor lived in multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, packed tightly with families who cooked over open flames and fetched water from public fountains. The wealthy lived in sprawling villas, surrounded by mosaics, fountains, and courtyards, their walls covered in frescoes that told stories of gods and heroes. The air was filled with the smells of oil and ash, wine and sweat, spices from distant ports, and incense from a dozen temples. Merchants shouted prices in the markets. Schoolboys recited Virgil in dusty courtyards. Senators passed through shaded porticos in long robes, their faces etched with the burden of ritual. It was a world of order and ambition, where social rank shaped every glance and gesture. In the provinces, life varied. Some towns looked like miniature Romes, complete with forums and aqueducts, arches and roads paved in stone. In Gaul, Roman culture blended with Celtic traditions. In Egypt, ancient temples stood beside Roman garrisons. In Judea, tension simmered beneath the surface as local customs clashed with imperial demands. But everywhere, the infrastructure of Rome followed. Roads were built to last, linking far-flung regions in a web of stone that allowed legions to march swiftly and messages to travel farther than ever before. Ships carried grain from Alexandria to feed the capital. Olive oil moved from Hispania. Silk came from the east, crossing deserts and empires. There were taxes and tithes, weights and measures, contracts and courts. Even time itself bent to Roman precision, measured in a calendar that carried the names of emperors. Religion was everywhere. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars still ruled in name, but mystery cults and Eastern divinities grew in popularity. People worshipped Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, and newer faiths that promised salvation and eternity. One of these, Christianity, still small and scattered, had begun to spread quietly from village to village, carried by letters, rumors, and converts who believed that the empire's greatness could not match the power of a suffering God. For now, it remained underground, tolerated or ignored by most, occasionally persecuted when it threatened the harmony of tradition. But it would not remain in shadows forever. Education flourished in cities. Boys of status were trained in rhetoric, logic, and law, their futures shaped toward public life or legal argument. Girls were mostly educated at home, raised for marriage, though exceptions existed in wealthier families. Literature was read aloud in public squares. Philosophers gathered in shaded courtyards. Medical texts passed from hand to hand. The arts thrived not only in marble statues and temple carvings, but in household decoration, in music played during banquets, in stories whispered by candlelight. Roman engineers constructed aqueducts that carried fresh water over mountains. They built bridges and theatres, basilicas and fortresses. Their tools were simple, but their vision was vast. Yet for all the structure, the hierarchy was clear. Most of the empire's people lived not in wealth, but in labour. Farmers worked the land for landlords they rarely met. Artisans struggled to survive in crowded cities. Slaves, numbering in the millions, performed every kind of labour from household chores to mining and education. A slave could be born into bondage, captured in war, or sold by poverty. Freedom was possible, but not guaranteed. The empire was a pyramid of privilege, and the weight of it rested on the backs of many. Still, it worked. It held. It endured longer than any other system of its kind had ever done. For nearly 200 years, through good emperors and bad, through minor wars and minor plagues, the empire functioned. Its people lived and died in its embrace, often never seeing the marble heart of the city that ruled them. Rome had created not just a capital, but a way of life, a pattern that promised order in exchange for obedience, peace in exchange for silence, bread and circuses in exchange for power. It was a bargain that many accepted, and for a time, it seemed eternal. But time does not freeze, even under stone arches and painted ceilings. The next century would bring new trials. The borders would crack. The legions would turn on each other. The gods would be challenged. And the peace that had held the world together would begin to unravel, thread by thread. There was no loud collapse. There was no single spark or thunderclap. The fall began like all falls do, not with drama, but with a quiet shift that went unnoticed until it was already too late. The Roman Empire, once a machine of order, began to slip out of rhythm. It happened slowly at first. A misstep here, a sudden silence there, a sense that something was wrong in the provinces even as the capital continued its rituals and games. Then the cracks widened. The year was 180 CE when Marcus Aurelius died, and with him ended the line of emperors who had ruled with wisdom and restraint. His son Commodus inherited the throne, not through merit or adoption, but through blood, and the consequences of that choice would echo for generations. Commodus was not the worst of men, but he was unprepared to rule an empire. He was raised in privilege, obsessed with his image, and fascinated more by spectacle than by administration. He styled himself a gladiator, fought in the arena, and saw governance as a stage where he alone deserved applause. The Senate grew resentful. The military grew wary, and the empire, for the first time in a long while, felt rudderless. Commodus was eventually assassinated in a palace conspiracy, strangled in his bath by a wrestler while Rome prepared for the new year. His death did not bring order. It opened the gates to chaos. In the decades that followed, the empire unraveled. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 emperors rose and fell, most of them military generals proclaimed by their troops in distant provinces. Few died of old age. Most were killed in battle, murdered by their own men, or executed by rivals. Rome had become a battlefield not of nations, but of ambition. The throne was no longer a symbol of law. It was a prize seized by force and abandoned in blood. Armies turned inward, fighting each other instead of defending the frontiers. Provinces rebelled, entire regions broke away. In Gaul, a splinter empire declared independence. In the east, the city of Palmyra rose under Queen Zenobia and carved out its own dominion. Rome no longer ruled the world. It was struggling to rule itself. As if internal collapse were not enough, disaster came from beyond. Germanic tribes pushed across the Rhine and Danube. The Sassanid Empire in Persia invaded from the east. Cities were sacked. Legions were routed. For the first time in centuries, the empire's borders were breached not as exceptions, but as patterns. Villages burned, fortresses fell. The illusion of eternal control shattered, trade slowed, coinage devalued, famine and plague returned. In some cities, the population fell by half. The streets that once rang with marble and voices echoed instead with fear and decay. The people whispered that the gods had turned their backs, that the empire had been punished for pride, that the end had come at last. And yet, the empire did not fall. In the middle of the storm, a few figures rose to hold the line. Among them was Emperor Aurelian, a soldier hardened by the frontier, who marched with relentless energy to restore what had been lost. He reconquered the breakaway regions, defeated the Eastern Queen who had defied Roman authority, and crushed the invaders who had dared breach the northern borders. He was given the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. He built walls around Rome itself, sensing that even the capital was no longer immune to danger. He ruled with discipline and clarity. But like so many before him, he was betrayed by his own men and died before his vision could fully take shape. The crisis of the 3rd century was not a single event. It was a long unraveling of confidence, a generation of fear and fire, when the empire seemed to move only from one emergency to the next. The system that had once seemed so eternal proved frighteningly fragile. It had expanded too far. It had depended too heavily on the loyalty of armies and the illusion of unity. It had failed to create a true succession. But even as the old forms cracked, something new began to stir beneath them. The empire had not died. It had changed. It had bent under pressure, but had not broken. And on the horizon, a new kind of emperor was rising. One who would no longer pretend that the Republic still lived. One who would accept the empire for what it had become and shape it with fire and reform. The Roman world stood at a crossroads. It had survived a storm that should have ended it. But the cost was written across every scarred city wall and every broken coin. The next age would not be a return to the past. It would be something else. Something harder. Something that would transform Rome forever. By the time Diocletian took the throne, the empire was exhausted. It had bled from too many wounds, buried too many emperors, and lost too much ground to trust in luck or tradition. When Diocletian rose from the ranks of the military in 284 CE and claimed power not by birthright but by control of the army, few could have guessed that he would become one of the most transformative figures in Roman history. He did not come with grand speeches or sweeping charisma. He came with structure. And that was what Rome needed most. Not another hero, not another myth, but a man who could stop the bleeding and teach the empire how to breathe again. The world Diocletian inherited was no longer one city ruling many. It was a fragile sprawl of provinces, cultures, languages, and crumbling frontiers. He understood that no single man could rule it all, not even with divine favor or military force. So he created something new. He divided the empire, not into chaos, but into symmetry. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, and gave him control of the western provinces, while Diocletian ruled the east. Together, they ruled as equals, each bearing the title of Augustus. Then they appointed 2 junior emperors beneath them, Caesars, who would assist in governance and be prepared to succeed them. This system, called the Tetrarchy, was designed not for glory, but for function. It gave the empire 4 centers of authority, 4 capitals, 4 pairs of hands to grasp the reins. It was not a return to the old republic. It was something entirely new. But Diocletian did not stop with the Tetrarchy. He reformed the army, increased its size, and stationed it more strategically along the borders. He revised the tax code, introduced new currency, and built bureaucracies capable of managing the daily burden of empire. He demanded loyalty not just to the state, but to the person of the emperor, elevating his own image with titles and ceremonies that had once been foreign to Roman tradition. He wore jeweled robes, required subjects to bow before him, and called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. The emperor was no longer a first citizen. He was a sacred figure, removed from the Senate and the people, a being of order above the chaos of the world. It was a sharp break from the past, but the past had failed. Diocletian had no use for nostalgia. He also turned his attention to religion. The Roman world was full of gods, old gods, new gods, gods from Egypt, Persia, and the East. But one faith in particular unsettled him. Christianity had spread through cities and countryside, practiced in secret and in public, drawing converts from slaves, merchants, women, and even some members of the elite. Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor, refused to acknowledge the old gods, and rejected the divine authority of the state. To Diocletian, this was not only heresy, it was rebellion. He launched what would become the last and most brutal persecution of Christians in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, believers were arrested, tortured, and executed. The empire burned its own citizens in the name of unity. But the faith did not die. It grew stronger, and Diocletian, in the end, could not stop it. In 305 CE, something extraordinary happened. Diocletian voluntarily stepped down from power. He retired to a palace on the Dalmatian coast, tending gardens and living in quiet seclusion, while the empire moved on without him. His co-emperor retired as well, following the design of the Tetrarchy. But the plan began to unravel almost immediately. Ambition returned. Loyalty fractured. The 4-man system collapsed into civil war. And out of that war rose another figure who would shape the future as completely as Diocletian had shaped the present. Constantine was the son of a Caesar, a soldier like many before him, and a man forged in the fires of succession struggle. He fought rivals in the West, claimed victories on the battlefield, and slowly carved his way towards supremacy. In 312 CE, on the eve of battle near the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, Constantine claimed to have seen a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words in this sign, "Conquer." He ordered his soldiers to place a Christian symbol on their shields. He won the battle and entered the city not as a pagan prince, but as a man with new conviction. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted legal tolerance to Christianity and ended the official persecution. It was not a full embrace, not yet, but it was the beginning of a transformation that would reach deep into every temple, every city, every household in the empire. Constantine did more than support a new faith. He reshaped the empire's very geography. He moved the capital east, away from Rome, away from the Senate, and away from the weight of old institutions. He chose the site of the ancient Greek city Byzantium, strategically perched on the Bosporus, and rebuilt it into a new imperial center. He filled it with palaces, churches, forums, and walls. He named it Constantinople. In doing so, he shifted the heart of the Roman world toward the east, where wealth was deeper, cities more numerous, and the borders easier to defend. The old city of Rome, though still honored, began to fade as the political center of power. A new Rome had been born. In 324 CE, Constantine became sole emperor of a reunited empire. He ruled until his death in 337 CE, baptizing into the Christian faith before passing, the first emperor to die a follower of the very God his predecessors had once tried to erase. Under his rule, Christianity spread into law, into administration, and into the hearts of the people. The pagan temples did not vanish overnight. The old gods still had their followers, but the current had shifted. The empire was becoming something new. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a tolerated minority. It was the state religion. The temples of Jupiter and Mars gave way to cathedrals. The images of emperors now shared space with saints. Pagan rituals were outlawed. The Senate, once the proud voice of Roman tradition, receded further into ceremony. And in 395 CE, after the death of Emperor Theodosius III, the empire was formally divided once more, this time not as a system of power sharing, but as two separate halves. The Western Roman Empire would be ruled from Milan and then Ravenna. The Eastern Roman Empire would remain centered in Constantinople. Diocletian had divided the empire to save it. Constantine had reassembled it and redirected its soul. Together, they had rewritten the nature of Roman rule, moving it from a republic to a monarchy, from polytheism to Christianity, from Rome to Constantinople. What began as a city beside the Tiber had become a continent-spanning civilization that spoke in many tongues and prayed in many ways. But even as the East began to flourish, the West would soon begin to fade. In the closing years of the 4th century, the western half of the Roman Empire stood like a weary giant, still impressive in name, still cloaked in tradition and memory, but weakened at the core. It remained grand in appearance, with its bishops and bureaucrats, its marble palaces and senatorial titles. But the strength that had once allowed it to conquer the known world was draining from its limbs. The emperors in the West wore the purple robe, but their authority was stretched thin. They relied more and more on military commanders to enforce policy, and those commanders, increasingly, were not Romans by blood or heritage. They came from beyond the frontier, born in the forests of Germania or along the steppes of Scythia, men raised in tribes once hunted by Rome who now fought within her armies, rose through her ranks, and shaped her future. The word barbarian had long been used by Romans to describe those who lived beyond the boundaries of their world, those who did not speak Latin or Greek, those who did not worship Jupiter or follow Roman law. It was a word of distance and disdain. But the reality was far more complex. The so-called barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Alans, Huns were not mindless hordes. They were societies with leaders, warriors, children, and histories of their own. They had long traded with Rome, served in its armies, and admired its cities. But as pressure mounted beyond the eastern borders, these tribes were being pushed westward in greater numbers. The Huns, fierce riders from the central plains of Eurasia, began a slow advance, displacing everyone in their path. The Gothic tribes, desperate to escape the violence, turned to Rome not as enemies, but as refugees. In 376 CE, a massive group of Visigoths gathered along the Danube River and asked to cross into Roman territory. They sought protection. They offered submission. The emperor at the time, Valens, granted them entry, but the officials tasked with managing the influx exploited them, extorted them, and let their suffering fester into fury. Within 2 years, the Visigoths had risen in rebellion. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, they faced the Roman army in open combat. The result was a disaster. Emperor Valens was killed in the fighting, and 2/3 of his army was destroyed. It was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman military history, not simply for the numbers lost, but for what it revealed. Rome could no longer control its borders. The legions, once the envy of the world, had been broken by men who had once begged to serve under their banner. The aftermath did not bring order. It brought uneasy arrangements and cycles of violence. The Visigoths were not driven out. Instead, they remained inside the empire, sometimes allies, sometimes threats, often moving in search of land and recognition. They were led by Alaric, a chieftain of deep ambition and skill, who had once served Rome and now turned against it. He wanted what so many others wanted, a place in the Roman system, a homeland for his people, legitimacy in the eyes of an empire that still claimed to be eternal. But he was denied, pushed aside by Roman officials who could not see past the old idea of Roman supremacy. And so he marched. In the year 410 CE, Alaric led his army to the gates of Rome itself. It had been over 800 years since the city had last been taken by foreign hands. Its walls had stood through centuries of war and peace. Its name had become synonymous with power and destiny. But now the unthinkable happened. The gates opened. The Visigoths entered. For 3 days, they moved through the city, looting treasures, taking what they could carry, but leaving much intact. They did not burn the city. They did not destroy it. But they shattered its illusion. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves through the world. To many, it felt like the end of everything. If Rome could fall, what else could stand? In truth, Rome had already been falling for some time. The capital of the Western Empire had been moved to Ravenna, a city better defended by marsh and sea. The Senate had become little more than a ceremonial body. Real power was held by generals, many of them non-Roman, who commanded armies that were loyal more to coin than to any idea of Roman identity. One of these generals was Stilicho, a man of Vandal origin, who fought to hold the empire together but was executed by the very court he served. Others would rise and fall in similar fashion, caught in webs of intrigue and betrayal. As the decades passed, more tribes crossed into Roman lands. The Vandals moved through Gaul, into Spain, and finally into North Africa, seizing Carthage and cutting off Rome's grain supply. The Franks settled in northern Gaul. The Huns, under the terrifying leadership of Attila, invaded from the east, threatening both halves of the empire. In 452 CE, Attila marched on Rome, but a delegation led by Pope Leo I convinced him to withdraw, though the reasons remain mysterious. Some said it was diplomacy. Others believed it was disease, famine, or superstition. Whatever the cause, Rome was spared again, but not for long. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Empire was no longer a sovereign force. It was a mosaic of failing provinces, abandoned garrisons, and shifting loyalties. The emperors themselves were often puppets, installed and removed by military strongmen who ruled behind the curtain. The line of Augustus had thinned to boys and ghosts, and though the Eastern Empire continued to grow stronger from its seat in Constantinople, the West had begun its final descent. What once had been the center of the world now waited quietly, hollowed out and dimming, as new powers circled like wolves beyond the trees. By the final decades of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a memory still walking in human shape. It had all the markings of power: imperial titles, marble halls, ancient rituals, but little of the substance that had once made Rome the master of the known world. The armies no longer marched at the call of the Senate. The laws passed in Ravenna echoed softly, but were rarely obeyed outside its walls. The emperor still wore the purple robe, but that robe was now threadbare, passed from hand to hand by men who knew that the real decisions were made by warlords with swords and private loyalties. The Western Empire had become a stage where the final act was being drawn out with pageantry and silence, even as the world changed around it. By this time, the once vast territories of the West had splintered into new kingdoms ruled by foreign generals who no longer pretended to be subjects of Rome. In Gaul, the Franks and Burgundians had carved out permanent settlements. In Spain, the Visigoths governed their own court and territory. In North Africa, the Vandals had claimed Carthage, ruled the sea routes, and even sacked Rome again in 455 CE, this time leaving devastation and bitterness that would linger in the memory far longer than the actual damage. These new kingdoms still spoke of Rome with a kind of inherited reverence, but they no longer answered to it. The empire existed in name, but its borders no longer held. The world had changed, and the empire had failed to change with it. Within Italy, a new figure had risen, not from the ancient senatorial families, not from the bloodline of Augustus, but from the ranks of the barbarian elite. His name was Odoacer, a commander of Germanic descent, who had fought in Roman service and understood the structures of power better than most born to it. In 476 CE, the Western emperor was a young boy named Romulus Augustulus, placed on the throne as a puppet by his father, who acted as the real authority behind him. The name itself was heavy with symbolism. Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome, and Augustus, like the first emperor. But the boy was no founder. He was no ruler. He was a figurehead caught in a tide he could not stop. Odoacer gathered his forces and marched to Ravenna. He did not come with legions of conquest. He did not burn cities or demand tribute. He simply removed the last emperor and informed the Eastern court in Constantinople that no new emperor would be appointed. There was no need for two emperors, he said. The West would now be governed by kings. The imperial regalia, crown, purple robe, scepter, was sent east as a gesture of respect, or perhaps of finality. And with that quiet act, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. There was no final battle. There was no public funeral. The Senate still met. Some cities still followed Roman law. The bishops still spoke in Latin. But the idea of Rome as a single power, stretching from ocean to ocean, had ended. What remained was a patchwork of kingdoms and cultures, each carrying pieces of the Roman legacy into a future that would no longer be called Roman. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, would endure for nearly 1,000 more years. But the West, the Rome of Caesar and Cicero, of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, of marble triumphs and iron law, had passed into history. For those who lived through it, the fall did not feel like a single moment. It felt like a dimming, like a city where the lights slowly faded one by one until only shadows remained. Farmers still plowed their fields. Traders still crossed old roads. Churches still rang their bells. But the world had shifted. The empire that had once named months, mapped the heavens, and ruled over kings had left behind only echoes. And in those echoes, a new Europe would be born. When the Western Roman Empire came to its quiet end in the 5th century, the world did not suddenly turn its face from Rome. In the East, the empire still stood. Its roads still hummed with trade. Its courts still issued law. Its armies still marched in formation. The old capital on the Tiber had grown brittle, but the new capital on the Bosporus was only just beginning to stretch into its full strength. This city, founded by Constantine and named in his honor, had grown into a fortress of stone and gold, surrounded by sea walls and guarded by layers of battlements that seemed to rise from the sea like the ramparts of myth. Constantinople was not a copy of old Rome. It was something different, shaped by centuries of Greek thought, Eastern influence, and Christian belief. It stood at the crossroads of worlds, where Asia met Europe, and it carried the Roman name with pride long after the city of Rome itself had become a relic. The people of this Eastern Empire never called themselves Byzantine. That name would come much later, created by historians to draw a line between the old and the new. But they did not see such a line. They called themselves Romans. Their empire was the Roman Empire. Their emperor was the successor of Augustus and Trajan, of Constantine and Theodosius. They wrote in Greek instead of Latin, prayed in churches instead of temples, and dressed their emperors in robes embroidered with crosses rather than eagles. But they kept the laws, the rituals, and the imperial ambition. The old republic had died long ago, but the idea of Rome still breathed within their walls. One emperor more than any other would define this new Roman identity. His name was Justinian, and he ruled in the 6th century with a mind sharpened by scholarship and a will hardened by struggle. He dreamed not of simply preserving the empire, but of restoring it. In the glittering halls of Constantinople, where mosaics sparkled with colored glass and domes soared like the heavens above, he laid plans to reclaim the lands of the fallen West. He sent his generals across the sea, men like Belisarius and Narses, who marched through North Africa and Italy with precision and fire. They defeated the Vandals in Carthage. They seized Sicily and Rome. They took Ravenna and held it. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old empire had been reborn, united once more from the shores of the Bosporus to the mountains of Gaul. But it was a reunion built on unstable ground. The wars drained the treasury. Plague returned and tore through the population like a blade. The enemies who had once been scattered now circled again, sharper and more determined. Even as Justinian rebuilt the church of Hagia Sophia into a masterpiece of light and geometry, even as he codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a collection that would shape legal systems for centuries to come, his empire was beginning to contract. It had reached its fingers too far and too quickly. When he died, the dream of full restoration faded with him. Still, what remained was strong. The Eastern Empire adapted. It shrank when it had to. It fortified its cities and restructured its armies. It watched as new faiths rose and challenged its borders. The rise of Islam in the 7th century changed everything. The armies of the Arab Caliphate swept across the old Roman provinces of the East, taking Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. They moved swiftly, carried by fire and belief. The Eastern Empire lost territory after territory, but it did not break. Constantinople stood. Its walls held firm. Its emperors endured. They no longer ruled the world, but they ruled themselves, and in doing so, kept the Roman light burning in the eastern sky. The people of Constantinople continued to believe in their empire. They prayed to saints, lit candles beneath golden icons, and debated theology with the same intensity that earlier generations had debated politics. They called their emperor Basileus, and he stood as both ruler and protector of the faith. The church and the state had become inseparable, and together they shaped a culture unlike anything in the world. Byzantine art glowed with gold and mystery. Byzantine diplomacy moved with careful patience. Byzantine survival depended not only on armies, but on understanding the delicate balance of war, marriage, religion, and trade. For centuries, this empire stood between Europe and the rising powers of the East. It was a shield, a mirror, a memory made real, and through it all, the name of Rome remained. Engraved in stone, whispered in prayer, carried in language and lore. The old capital had faded, but the idea lived on. It lived in every citizen who called himself Roman. It lived in every law written in the emperor's name. It lived in every morning when the bells of Hagia Sophia rang across the city and reminded the world that though time had passed, the empire was not yet finished. The Eastern Roman Empire had endured storms that would have drowned lesser powers. It had bent, but not broken beneath invasions, rebellions, plagues, and religious upheaval. Its people had watched the world change around them, watched kingdoms rise and fall, watched the map of Europe shift like sand in the wind. But still, they called themselves Romans. Still, they gathered beneath their golden domes and chanted hymns in the shadow of mosaics that gleamed like sunlight caught in stone. They believed their city was eternal. They believed their walls would never fall. And for centuries, it seemed they might be right. But no empire lasts forever. Not even one that has outlived its twin. Not even one guarded by 3 rings of walls and the deepest harbour in the known world. The decline of Constantinople was not sudden. It was a slow fading, a loss of breath that stretched across generations. By the 11th century, the empire had grown smaller and more fragile. Its armies were no longer the disciplined ranks of old. Its economy staggered beneath the weight of war and trade imbalances. The rise of the Seljuk Turks in the east pushed against its borders. Anatolia, once the heartland of Roman grain and soldiers, slipped from imperial control. Defeats on the battlefield began to feel permanent. Resources drained away, and with them, the confidence that had once filled the marble streets of the capital. Then came the moment that shattered more than territory. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, an army of Latin Christians from Western Europe turned their swords not against the Muslims of the Holy Land, but against the city of Constantinople itself. Enticed by politics, greed, and broken promises, they attacked the city they had sworn to protect. They breached the walls. They looted the churches. They burned the libraries, and for 3 days, the Queen of Cities was reduced to ash and screams. Holy relics were taken, gold was melted, monks were slaughtered, women were dragged from sanctuaries. It was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. And it was delivered not by foreign enemies, but by those who claimed the same faith. The empire was carved into pieces, ruled by Western lords who did not understand its language, its laws, or its soul. But even then, it was not truly dead. In 1261, Byzantine forces recaptured the city and restored imperial rule. The emperors returned, the liturgies resumed, the mosaics were repaired, but something essential had been lost. Constantinople had survived, but it had been wounded beyond healing. The years that followed were years of survival. The empire was now a shadow of its former self, confined to the city and a few scattered territories in Greece. The emperors were no longer rulers of a vast dominion. They were guardians of a relic, stewards of a legacy that stretched back to Augustus and Romulus, but could no longer command armies or shape the course of nations. And while the empire withered, a new power rose. The Ottoman Turks, forged in Anatolia, organized and relentless, moved ever closer to the heart of the Byzantine world. They conquered city after city, province after province, until only Constantinople remained. The walls were still strong, the spirit was still proud, but the numbers no longer mattered, the armies no longer matched. The Ottomans surrounded the city with cannons and siege towers. In the spring of 1453, Sultan Mehmed II began his final assault. For 53 days, the defenders of Constantinople resisted. Citizens, monks, soldiers, and foreign volunteers fought side by side along the walls. The city prayed in churches, sang from rooftops, and waited for a miracle. But no miracle came. On the 29th of May, the walls were breached. The gates were overwhelmed, and the last emperor, Constantine V, descendant of a line that stretched back more than 1,000 years, died sword in hand at the final barricade. His body was never found. The city fell. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia was emptied, its altars stripped, its bells silenced. Then it was consecrated again, not as a Christian basilica, but as a mosque. The Ottomans marched through the streets, not as destroyers, but as conquerors who understood the value of what they had taken. Constantinople became Istanbul, and the empire, which had once ruled from Britannia to Egypt, from Gaul to Mesopotamia, breathed its last. And yet, even in death, Rome did not vanish. It lived on in the laws passed down to kingdoms and courts across Europe. It lived on in the language of science and the shape of churches. It lived in the architecture of cathedrals, in the organization of armies, in the dreams of emperors who would come centuries later and call themselves Caesars in Russian and German tongues. The idea of Rome had outlived the city itself. It had passed from myth to reality and then back again. In the end, the Roman Empire had lasted for over 2,000 years. From the hills of a shepherd's village by the Tiber to the golden walls of Constantinople beside the Bosporus, it had conquered, governed, adapted, and endured. It had written laws, raised gods, buried nations, and whispered across time that power could be eternal. But power never is. Only memory endures. Only story remains. And this one, this story of marble and blood, of gods and emperors, of centuries shaped by vision and violence, is now yours. Good night.